Hey, welcome back to another Bitcoin Reformation Podcast. I'm Ben Haupt, joined by my co-host, Jared Townley. Our friend David Ruffner is not with us today. Couldn't be with us, but we're joined by two guests, Jordan Bush and Dan Sherman, and I want to tell you a little bit about them. Dan serves with Power to Change in Canada, where he helps students take their next step toward Jesus, holds a Bachelor of Mathematics and Statistics from Carleton University, and a Master of Theological Studies from Heritage Seminary. Dan also serves on the board of Bitcoin is Better, a nonprofit aimed to educate the middle class about Bitcoin, and is a friend of the organization Thank God for Bitcoin. We'll talk a little bit more about that organization in a minute. Jordan Bush is the founder and executive director of Thank God for Bitcoin Media, which exists to help Christians understand and use Bitcoin for the glory of God and the good news of people everywhere. He's a husband, father of four, enjoys writing, podcasting. He blogs at economicsofglory.substack.com. He's the host of Thank God for Bitcoin podcast, and he helped author this book, Thank God for Bitcoin. Jordan, Dan, great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, we want to start right out by hearing your Bitcoin story. And this is always something that is helpful to hear others just kind of reflect, how'd you get into Bitcoin in the first place? I happen to know a little bit about Jordan's story of getting into Bitcoin because he talks about it in his book, Thank God for Bitcoin. And so, Jordan, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and some of your experiences growing up that led you to get interested in Bitcoin.
Yeah. So I grew up in upstate New York. My parents worked for a Christian nonprofit organization that had a goal of basically helping the youth, basically reaching youth with the gospel of Christ. And so I grew up in a Christian household. My mom and dad were Christians. We went to church, all the time, and I made a profession of faith at a young age. And then kind of just over time, I started going to like a public school, and there weren't a ton of Christians. And so over time, just I kind of I still, I believed in Jesus, knew it was true, knew all those things, but just over time, I just wanted friends and just to be liked. And so, just kind of started going this way. And then when I got into later years of high school, I was at a Christian camp, heard the gospel preached. I could have articulated to you the same gospel message, up until that point for just word for word. And yet, preach the gospel, and it was like the lights came on, and all of a sudden this thing that I knew was true but had no desire for, that's all I wanted to do. And so I just as soon as that happened, like all I wanted to do was get alone by myself and read the Bible and pray. A very Lutheran desire, one might say. But so that was kind of how that started, and then ended up going to Bible college. My wife and I met there, and just separately realized that we wanted to be missionaries. We heard that there's, hundreds of, basically at that point, thousands of languages that still had no scripture translated into their language, and so we got married knowing that we wanted to do that, and so we started raising support. Ended up moving to Uruguay in South America, and again, we're surprised to find that in this urban jungle, where that was far more like you broke off a piece of like post-Christian Europe and wedged it onto South America. We were surprised to find a bunch of Venezuelan immigrants who were pouring into the country, and so we there's about 60,000 at one point that had come in, and so I just started, as we're just doing normal ministry, started just trying to understand why they were doing that, like why now, why so many of you, what's going on, and just discovered and was told that the government had hyperinflated their currency. One of the easiest ways for politicians in the modern world to get elected is to promise free stuff. And in a world of fiat currencies, the way that you pay for that free stuff is just by printing more money. And so the Venezuelan government basically printed money till it became worthless, and the people, literally wasn't good for anything. And so people were throwing it out into the street or turning it into arts and crafts or, stuff like that. So we ended up, we have friends who they would tell us, hey, my brother went to the grocery store this morning. Milk was $5 a gallon. He went in the afternoon, it was $10 a gallon. And so just that on a day-to-day basis, just extraordinary levels of inflation. And so that was kind of my introduction to this problem. but I didn't have any kind of idea of a solution. I didn't have any, kind of what do you do about this in a positive or proactive way. And so that wouldn't come until about 4 years later. I heard about Bitcoin, started looking into Bitcoin, needed to figure out some way to invest for the sake of my family. I'd been, our missions organization, I'm sure similar to Dan's, they have something that's called like a 403B, which is basically the nonprofit equivalent of a 401k. And so I'd been putting money into it for 6 or 7 years and hadn't even looked at it. And so I just started trying to figure out.
Exactly the same, right?
Yeah. So just trying to figure out, like I'd made a little bit of money, but was just trying to understand, like, okay, I should probably do something with this, but I have no framework to know what to do. And so the only thing I knew about investing was that you're supposed to buy low and sell high. And as I looked at the investing landscape, I realized that everything was at all-time highs. And so I was like, well, I was not prepared for this. And so I'm like, what do you do when everything is at all-time highs? And so as part of my journey, I looked into Bitcoin and just was really, I basically bought a whole bunch of it, as much as a missionary can purchase, but ended up buying it relative to percentage-wise. I bought a bunch of it, and then just the more that I got into it, the more that I started to see a lot of things that really shocked and surprised me, and that led me to be even more interested in it because of reasons that we'll get into. So, but that was about 2019 when I really took about 7 or 8 months and went down the rabbit hole.
I love to hear everybody's story too, right? 'Cause, you're a Bitcoiner, you've been around, you've heard the stories, and it almost seems like everyone has some sort of, I saw it, I heard it, and then I fell in. And I think that we hope that this podcast is part of that process for a lot of people too. So Thank you for sharing that. All right, Dan, flip it over to you. What's your Bitcoin story? How'd you get here? How did you fall down the hole?
The Bitcoin rabbit hole. Yeah, for me, it started probably, there have been precursors to it, but it mostly started in 2020 when we're coming towards the end of the year, and obviously 2020 was just a crazy, strange year for so many people. But I was looking back on the year and I kind of doing some number crunching, and I was like, why did my house make just as much money as I did? And it's just this really strange feeling where I was like, and then I looked at the Canadian national average. The average house in Canada rose by the same amount as the average wage in Canada. And so you could literally have taken a break for 2020 and just sat on a house, and somehow if you could extrapolate that money from it through a reverse mortgage or something, you literally would have been just as good off had you poured out your blood, sweat, and tears the entire year. And I worked hard in 2020. Like, I took on a new role in my job. We had to transition so many different things. Like transition, the word transition was the theme of the year, trying to figure out how can we still keep ministering to students, because I'm in student ministry. How can we keep ministering to students in the midst of when we can't even meet them in person? So it just was crazy to me to think that my home value and the home value of everyone who has had houses would be the equivalent of of the average wage. And so that got me thinking about all kinds of things, and namely, like I started asking the question, like, what is money, and in different forms. And I originally I got into Peter Schiff a little bit, and started investing. Yeah, I started investing in some gold stocks. I was like, okay, I think I understand why gold has value, and I understood its scarcity. But then at the same time, the year before that, a buddy of mine, it was 2019, and or was it maybe it was 2 years before that, but he was a Bitcoiner, and I remember we were sitting in his little basement apartment that they were renting, just a really small place, and we were talking about finances, and I was like, asked him, like, hey, are you guys considering buying a house at some point? And he's like, oh yeah, don't worry, like one day I'll buy a massive house with Bitcoin. And I was like, I remember looking at him being like, dude, like you're crazy. Like, there's just no way. Like, it's like you're putting your hopes on a wing and a prayer there. And lo and behold, now he has a house twice the size of mine, and he's living pretty, because he sold at the peak of, was it 2021? Yeah, right at the top, which is nice. But anyway, so we're getting towards the end of 2020. And I'm starting to think through that, maybe there's something here to Bitcoin. And the big thing that was preventing me from investing at that point was this idea that what if it's just a fad? What if it's just something that's here just for a few years and then it just goes away? And being a Christian, so much of my beliefs are rooted in what I read in Scripture. And so I just happened to be reading the story in Genesis where Abraham is buying a burial plot for his late wife, Sarah. Just this obscure part of Genesis 23 or something. You can look it up, but I tell the story a bit in the book. But here's Abraham. He goes before the people of the land in the land of Canaan, and he brokers this deal to buy this burial plot for, I think it's like 30 shekels of silver. And they weigh out the silver. There's all the elders gather around. He finds the guy who's selling him the land. He gives the guy the silver. The guy publicly says, okay, it is yours. The land is yours. And all the elders are there to witness it. And for some reason, in that moment, the light bulb went on. I was like, this is basically an ancient form of how Bitcoin works. This is like a 4,000-year-old way that Bitcoin works, because Bitcoin works by every node validating a transaction. And in this instance in Genesis, it's basically every elder was watching the transaction happen. So there didn't have to be a lawyer present. There didn't have to be, a signing of a paper. The only thing they needed was that all the elders were there standing around watching it happen, and it was logged into their memory, and therefore that made it valid. And so that's the exact same way that Bitcoin works with nodes verifying transactions today, but only in a global and digital sense. And the light bulb went on in that moment. And so I was telling you guys just before I was talking just before the show started that technically I am class of 2020. I think my first Bitcoin buy was December 31st. So I just put myself in that same camp as Sailor, buying the same year as Sailor, got into it, and that'll be my claim to fame.
I love that. It's really good to talk to you guys, because for the first couple of years that I was in Bitcoin, I didn't think that there were any other Christians in Bitcoin. So 2016, it was a crazy time, and I didn't know anything about anything. When I first got into Bitcoin, you couldn't buy Ethereum on Coinbase. So it was a crazy time.
What great days those were.
Oh yeah. I was
to be young again.
Yeah, terrified at the run up in 2017 and then the huge crash. Thankfully, my wife kept me from selling all of my Bitcoin at $3,000. But for a good while, I think Jimmy Song was the first Christian that I came across that was into Bitcoin and was publicly talking about his faith and talking about Bitcoin. And I have his book, The American Dream, up here, Bitcoin and the American Dream. But since then, there have been a bunch of people that have written books and begun to bring Bitcoin and Christianity together. And so I want to talk about one of the early kind of movements, or one of the big organizations that really got a lot of stuff started, and it's Thank God for Bitcoin. So Jordan, you were a part of the formation of that organization, and that book, I mean, man, when I first came across it, I had no idea the big names that Robert Breedlove and Jimmy Song. So how did you get connected up with all these Christian Bitcoiners, and how did the book come about?
It was a grand plan that I had. I just weaved it all, no, it was not that at all. I was literally living in Uruguay. I was, again, COVID had just started. It was, I think, April 2020. So I think we met for a while via Zoom for church. And so that we're just doing ministry. We're like delivering food to people and stuff. And so I ended up just on Twitter one day, and I saw this guy, Matthew, I can't remember his last name, but he's a pastor of a church somewhere in Texas. And he was just he said something about Bitcoin and Jesus. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? Right. And so, because I'd been thinking a lot about it for probably about 9 or 10 months. And so it wasn't until he said something about it that I realized that, again, to your point, I realized I was like, oh wait, there's at least one other person out there. Right. So I just sent him a DM and said, hey man, like, that's so crazy. And, good to meet you or whatever. And so he just basically said, hey, there's a group of us that are doing a book club right now. We just started. We're reading through we're reading through the Ethics of Money Production by Jörg Guido Holzmann, which is this awesome. Like, if you are a thinking Christian, you need to own that book. It is fantastic. You can actually we don't have it uploaded yet. I've got a whole bunch of copies of it that we're going to be selling on our website. But go grab that book. It's fantastic. So I just was like, he just said, "Hey, do you want to be a part of this?" And I said, "Sure." Like, sure. And he said, "Yeah, we're meeting like one day a week for like an hour, just read and then just kind of talk about what we read." So I was like, "All right, sweet." So he put me in the group, and again, I'd been in Bitcoin for less than a year at that point, and I didn't really know people in the space. So I saw Jimmy's in there. I didn't know Jimmy at all. I was like, "Who's this Asian cowboy? Like, what in the world is going on?" And then I saw Robert. Now, Robert had published like his piece on the origin of the number zero. Like, that was interesting. And so then I had found there might have been like one other person who I knew, but the vast majority of them, I just had no clue who they were. So anyhow, they added me to this group, and for about a month and a half, we finished that book and then read another book by a Austrian economist and basically a guy who helped with Ron Paul's monetary policy named Gary North. He wrote a book called Honest Money, and so we read through that book as well. And again, just thought it was really interesting, got done, thought that was the weirdest thing that I've ever participated in. And then I guess about 2 weeks went by, and after 2 weeks, one of the guys who had taken part in the book club reached out and said, "Hey man, like, we really appreciated your contribution to the book club." Basically, but we were unsatisfied with their conclusion because, in both those cases for those books that are otherwise awesome, their thing is, all right, this is why we need to go back to the gold standard. This will fix the problems. And while, again, I think gold is great, I think gold is certainly better than fiat and a lot of things like that. I just basically, we were all convinced that there's some shortcomings that, enabled the situation that we're in to happen in the first place. And so we thought that Bitcoin was a better option. And so this guy just basically said, "Hey, like, if you want to contribute to this, we're going to write our own book." And so I just basically said to him, "Hey man, like, thanks for thinking of me, but like, I'm pastor in this small church. I don't have time to write a book." And he said, "Well, actually, we're going to meet like this, like an hour a week, and we'll just take turns, fleshing out chapters and stuff, and then it'll just take as long as it takes." And so I said, "All right, I'll do that." And so about 6 or 7 months later, we published the book, got to experience, I'm so glad I'm with Lutherans. You guys will appreciate this. Got to experience every Protestant's dream, which was the book came out the same week as a book by the Pope, and we started outselling the Pope. We said, "Take that, Bishop of Rome. This is Reformation 2021, baby." We're reliving all the joys of Luther. So we did that, and then again, the rest is history. So we've sold way more copies of the book than we ever had any business imagining that we would sell. And so it's just been cool to find people all over the world who have found our silly little book and benefited from it.
So good. That book, my take is that it's written for people who are Bitcoin curious Christians, but who don't understand Bitcoin and need kind of a Christian to come alongside of them and talk some about the ethics, talk some about the kind of logistics of how Bitcoin works. Really, really helpful book for our listeners. By all means, pick up a copy of Thank God for Bitcoin. You do a conference as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, long story short, we came back from Uruguay in the end of 2021. There's a number of reasons why, but one of the reasons was because just like denominationally, I was coming under different convictions, and so I just basically was like, I'm pretty sure I'm Presbyterian, and I'm pretty sure I'm appreciating what they're putting out there, and so again, all of the church that we help plant was a Baptist church. All of our supporting churches and supporting families were Baptists. And so again, we just were like, man, this is gonna introduce some difficulty here. And then again, doing ministry as a Presbyterian is a little bit more involved in terms of the processes for sending you out than it is in Baptist world. So we ended up coming back, and I just started looking for a job, and ended up was going to go to the Bitcoin conference to look for at least a part-time job in May of 2022. And so about 4 months before that, Jimmy, after the book had been out for about a year, and Jimmy Song, one of the other authors, basically said, "Hey, we should do like a one-day Thank God for Bitcoin conference the day before the big Bitcoin conference in Miami." And so there's going to be like 30,000 people at this big conference. And so we just said, okay, yeah. And so he asked me if I would put it together. And so me and another guy, it was about 6 weeks out from the event. We just said, all right, let's try to see if we can get to come speak and whatever. And so we ended up finding a whole bunch of people who are really well known in the Bitcoin world who were willing to come for free, like last minute. And so long story short, we ended up putting on this conference. And then in the aftermath, some of the other authors at Thank God for Bitcoin, who were all either early Bitcoin adopters, some of them buying a Bitcoin at like less than $5 a coin, they just went out and he just basically came to me and they said, hey, you guys did a great job. If you want to turn this into a business, like we'd love to give you give you runway to just kind of make hay and go for it and just help the Christian world understand Bitcoin and why it matters. And so I just was kind of floored. I'd gone there with my resume to look for some kind of job and hadn't given a second thought to the possibility that what the event that I had helped plan would actually be that job. And so long story short, about 2 months later, we had raised funding from those guys and started, Thank God for Bitcoin. So basically we do one bigger event every year. It's either 1 or 2 days. And so this year we actually don't even have tickets available yet, but it's going to be, it looks like late September, early October. We're going to be in Nashville. And then in addition to that, the thing that actually is available, we are going to do, basically up to this point, we've piggybacked off of the big Bitcoin conferences. And so we're not going to do our event. Their event is in Las Vegas, that noted Christian bastion of old. And so we just basically talked to a whole bunch of people who have come to all of our other conferences who were like, I don't really want to go to Vegas. And so we were like, all right, let's do something different. So we're going to do the big conference in Nashville later this year. But in Vegas in May, the day before the big Bitcoin conference, we're going to do a VIP barbecue lunch. So we're going to smoke some ribs, smoke some brisket, get a whole bunch of fixins and drinks and just enjoy company and do like a networking event in Vegas. So I'll get you guys the link to that. That's kind of the thing that's coming up here in May. So
very cool. So I think now we should sort of switch and go back to you, Dan. So Dan, with Jordan's collaboration there, wrote also a book as well. And so I am curious, Dan, first, you tell the story in the book about kind of how you got here. And it's something that I feel like, as someone who spends probably too much time on X, feel like I've seen people talk about and all those sort of things. So first, maybe talk about your impetus for the book. And then I'd be curious, how and why you chose the format that you did too, as you sort of went through. So why the book, and then kind of how and why you wrote it in the way you did.
Sure. So like I said, I work for Power to Change Students, which is a division of Crew. If you guys are familiar, maybe some of your audience would be familiar with Crew, one of the largest missionary sending organizations in the world. And yeah, why did I start this book? I grew up as a Crew kid. My parents were involved. My mom's from the States, grew up in Crew and was on staff for 40 years. My dad on staff for 40 years as well. And in Canada, they got married and lived in Canada, and I've been born and raised here. But so they are in charge of what's something called the Christian Embassy of Canada. So Christian Embassy, they basically orient their lives around reaching what's called the up and out of the world. These are the elites of the world. So this is like, my dad's basically like a chaplain for our Parliament Hill. He's had prayer with like Justin Trudeau. He's met Stephen Harper, and like he knows these guys on first name basis. So he's in that world as a chaplain. He's also ministering to foreign ambassadors in the city of Ottawa and upper tier business leaders. So he calls them the up and out. They're the opposite of the down and out. And I think part of what he's been doing kind of has trickled down into my life, because I want to be someone who reaches people who will be influencers of the world. And so I start the book with a chapter called Dear Bitcoiner. And it's basically this idea that painting the picture of like who Bitcoiners are and who they will become. As you guys know, you can hold Bitcoin. If you hold Bitcoin long into the future, things are going to change, right? Like I think we're all believers here that Bitcoin is a revolution that's going to change the world, and it already is actively changing the world, and it's just not going to stop. It's not going to stop growing in monetary value, and and in influence. And that means that the people who hold it will continue to grow in influence and power in the world. And so the heart behind this is really, how can we reach the future elites of the world? How can we reach people who are going to have insane amounts of wealth? How can we reach the Michael Saylors, the Max Kaisers, you name it, people who have hodled Bitcoin for years, and now they can move like tons. They could cause people to do things. I was gonna say they can move mountains, but in some sense you can. Like, when you have a lot of money, you have a lot of power. And so the heart behind this is to help people like this, who are going to be some of the wealthiest people in the world and have major influence, help them to think through, like, what is their purpose, and what are they going to do with that wealth when they get it, and if they get it, and what are their values, and how can they consider who Jesus is as in light of that, so that they can hopefully be shaped in their character. Yeah, there's a passage that I get into in the first chapter where it's the Apostle Peter, and he's looking forward at the end of the world. He paints a picture of, like, the judgment is coming, the world's going to end, and then he says this line. He says, instead of, like, prepping a food shelter, instead of prepping water, buying land, buying guns, he says, who ought you to be? Like, knowing that the end of the world's coming, who ought you to be? And I'm presenting this book as a chance for Bitcoiners to reflect on their character and ask the question, like, who am I? Like, truly, who am I? St. Augustine said, know yourself and know God. And you can't really have one without the other. Like, understanding who you are is correlated to knowing God, and knowing God is correlated to knowing yourself. And so it's an invitation in that regard. I don't know if I answered the second part of your question, because I can't remember.
Yeah, so I mean, I love the heart. You also tell the story of someone who won the lottery, right? And then basically their life explodes. And by the time they're done, they're like, I wish I wouldn't even had all this stuff. And I think that's such a compelling case and a reason for people to care, that if I've been a Christian follower of Jesus my life, but if I'm trying to imagine myself in someone else's shoes, if I really believe what this thing about Bitcoin is going to do, then I do need to think about this, because I don't want to be that guy. We've all heard those sort of stories. And so I just think it's such a compelling hook for people to sort of get them to care, that then you sort of take them on a journey through a bunch of other stuff too. So as I was reading through, it sort of seems like the flow is, hey, here's a real world example, here's a teaching on Bitcoin, and then here's a teaching from sort of how faith relates to that. But I read earlier too that, you said you did some research in trying to figure out ways in which people who weren't maybe Christians, or who were curious, right, that how would they receive this well? So I'm just curious, what was your thought process, and kind of how you decided to kind of hook people, but then also how to, like, bring them in to that message, that good news of Jesus, and how it applies to Bitcoin. I mean, you do it really well in a way that feels really natural to me, but to me, that's not something that just kind of comes easily. So I'm curious kind of how your thought process went and what that process was like.
Yeah, in all honesty, it's a bit of a mystery to me as well. Maybe it's just, having been a missionary for 17 years now, you just get used to some of the lingo and the way of trying to relate to people who would be considered outside the faith, and try to share things in a way that is compelling for them. And so, I mean, that's definitely what I try to do. But yeah, in terms of research that I did, I can't think of any particular research that I did in terms of, like, studying what is the the research I do is probably just listening to a ton of Bitcoin podcasts. And so, like, you hear all the time, like, where Bitcoiners are at. And then naturally my mind, and you guys might probably do this too, is like, you just naturally draw those connections to, how does this relate to stuff that we're reading in scripture? How does this relate to areas of our faith? And so it just seems like engrossing myself in having been bathing in the Christian ethos for so long, being born and raised a Christian and working for a Christian ministry, but then also bathing myself in the Bitcoin ecosystem and and knowing Bitcoiners, listening to them talk on a regular basis, like you just kind of the synapses just form, and you just naturally draw things out. So there's probably some of that.
One of the other one of the other possible names we had for the book was Mere Bitcoin, and because there's a real sense in which like that's kind of like the heart of Mere Christianity, is kind of was the heart of this book, and so I think that's one of the things. Like when I first found Dan, the way that Dan and I met was on Twitter. He had shared this video from his YouTube channel. He has like I think 3 videos on his YouTube channel, but I was like, this is like C.S. Lewis became a Bitcoiner. And again, a lot of the ways that he like a lot of the things that he talked about was exactly like very similar to ways that I'd been thinking, and I've been very affected by C.S. Lewis's life and ministry as well. And so I think that's the thing, is just like trying to, you're looking at this thing, you've looked at it for so long, you see there's so many elements of it where you're like, oh man, like that just points at this and that just points to this. And just, again, looking at and just realizing we live in a world that was made by God. Like everything that exists is really a parable. Like everything within creation is designed to orient us toward the Lord and to point us toward ultimate spiritual reality. And so again, we can look at something like, we see the Apostle James. He talks about every good gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. And so like all of these things are, every good thing, if it's actually in service of God and in the good of people, it is designed to point us towards ultimate reality. And we can learn things about God and teach other people things about God by looking at these good gifts and ways that God has structured and oriented the world. And then just kind of, again, sharing our insights, sharing like what we think about as Christians when we look at these things. And so I think that was, the more that Dan and I talked, the more we were like, man, we should do this. That took way longer than we were anticipating. It was way harder. It was way all of these things. But again, the Lord sanctified us through the process, and it ended up being a really satisfying process to kind of be on this side of. Like doing the podcasts about it, it's just like, it's all gravy, because just, the work that goes into those kind of projects, it's just always way more than you think it's going to be. So
total labor of love. I just finished reading N.T. Wright's Simply Christian, which reads very similar to Mere Christianity and to the Gospel According to Bitcoin, in that it uses these parables and is really trying to make Christianity user-friendly. You talk about the Gospel according to the jet engine for people that are into jet engines, right? But I wanted to ask a little bit about this. In your preface, which is, I think, co-written, you guys say, as authors, we have met many people who have experienced a spiritual revival after discovering Bitcoin. To our knowledge, no one has researched why this phenomenon exists, yet we know several people who have told us that since learning about Bitcoin, they began praying, attending church, and dusting off their Bibles. They've rekindled or started a fresh relationship with God. Why would learning about a cryptocurrency lead someone to explore Christianity? That is such a poignant couple of sentences. We've talked about this as podcast hosts, that we're seeing these posts on X about people who are coming to faith, or who are at least all of a sudden curious about Christianity, even though they were complete atheists and really hated the whole mindset of Christianity. So I'm interested first in, do you guys have plans to do some of that research? And secondly, what are some of the reasons? I mean, you say then seeing connections in this book will help explain why. So I'd be interested to hear any thoughts of stories you've heard and people coming to faith.
Yeah, I guess I could start. The first guy I heard that this happened to was a guy, he goes by the handle, The Rules Are Broken, aka Boomer on X. And he's a guy, he lives in Ottawa, a fellow Canadian. But yeah, he replied to some, maybe it was my ex tweet or someone else's, but yeah, just expressed like that he's started going to church again since he discovered Bitcoin. And then I've heard other people chime in and say like, oh, this is my first like Death in Bitcoin. If you follow her, she posted this picture a year ago or so, like of her first Bible, and it's because and she's I asked like, well, what brought you into this? And she's like, well, Bitcoin. Yeah, but I was like, yeah, but can you tell me more? And she says that it worked. Like, she was just so distraught with the state of the world. Then she discovered Bitcoin, and suddenly she became hopeful for things. And so she kept saying the phrase, "Thank God for Bitcoin," out loud. And she says it turned into a prayer that hasn't stopped. So literally, she just started thanking God for Bitcoin. She's just so grateful that God had allowed for Bitcoin to come into the world and save us from this fiat, nightmare that we could find ourselves in, and that it literally led her to Christ. And so I think it's incredible. It's a phenomenon that I keep hearing in different little ways. Like Jordan and I were on a podcast with, what's the guy? He's based out of Austria, Robin Sayer.
Yep.
Yeah. A couple weeks ago, and he was saying how he's now like he's just more open to things spiritually, even though he's like formerly left the church and stuff, and a lot of this just stems from being in Bitcoin and discovering something that is really a sense of hope for your finances and for the economy and for the world as a result of that.
Yeah, I think the thing that, because again, I literally meet people all the time, just due to the nature of being the Christian, one of the Christian Bitcoin guys. Like people are, it's one thing we talk about. And one of the things that I really attribute it to, this phenomenon, which sounds perfectly preposterous. Like, if you're sitting there like, these guys are insane. Like, yes, I totally am very sympathetic to you. They are insane, but for different reasons. But the reason why this keeps happening is because like so much of the world, like when you basically, so there's, again, I mentioned this verse in the beginning. One of the things that Jesus said was that he said that those who are well have no need of a physician. And so it's those who are sick who recognize their need of a physician. And so one of the things, like when you go down this like fiat rabbit hole of seeing the way that the world for most of human history has worked, where we've had scarce money, and you see the cut in what that produced, and then you see throughout history this well-defined history of, over time, governments, they move away from scarce currency in order to try to maintain or increase their control and their power. They move away from scarce currency into a currency that they control and that they can create more currency units of slowly over time. When you see the effect that has, basically its effect on a number of levels. Obviously, the immediate impact is that they have more purchasing power to do whatever they want with. And so whether that's, that could be something as simple as going to war. It could be something as simple as, I want to do these building projects. I want to do whatever it is. If you create the money, you have more power. And so money is a very real instrument by which sinful man can say, either sinful man, I guess any kind of man can say, let my kingdom come, let my will be done on earth as it, on heaven as it is on earth. And so we can basically take this good gift, take this tool, and turn it around and use it to elevate our own vanity, or elevate, this could be at an individual basis or a national basis or whatever. And so one of the things that you see is that over time, where that happens, the ability to create money, and once that gets to the later stages, it enables you to, like, you don't get what you want, you get what you subsidize. Okay, this is true if you're a parent. This is true if you're, whatever. You get what you subsidize. And so there's a real reality that, if a government can create money out of thin air, they can fund whatever they want to. And it could be normal, sane things, but increasing over time, it becomes more and more insane and unnatural. And so as we're seeing through this whole USAID thing, we're finding that it's not really, it's actually it ought to have been and ought to be a huge encouragement to us that the world actually isn't as crazy as the actual people who live in the United States aren't actually as crazy as the, as the news and all these things would have us believe. It's really just the fact that a small group of very powerful people get access to tons of money that's created out of thin air, and then they use that to subsidize, again, their own financial well-being or insane beliefs. And so governments, one of the reasons why, governments are sponsoring sex changes in the Middle East, or African abortions, the only reason they can do that is because they're able to create money out of thin air through deficit spending and then give that debt, not pay that debt themselves, but basically kick that debt down the road for your children and your grandchildren to pay. And so again, where you have the only reason why, basically that's able to happen is because we have a currency that's not scarce. And so again, it ought to make sense to you that the peak, I would argue, and I don't see any way this isn't the case. The peak in terms of the percentage of people around the world who are atheist, okay, that the atheism peak would correspond with fiat peak. Okay? That makes total sense to me that those two things would correspond, because with fiat currency, you can create a fake world. You can create a world that seems like it operates far differently than the world that God actually made, free of the confines that God describes. And so the more that we see that world start to crumble, if you experience and see, wait a second, there's holes in that world. That's not actually the way that the world actually works. If you start to see that narrative crumble, you start to see things that the scripture talks about, they make a lot more sense. And the way that God describes the world, it actually makes a lot more sense. And it has this ring of truth that can get blocked, or, the light from that reality can get blocked by this veil that kind of can cover your eyes. So I know that's a whole weird way to look at it, but the more that I think about it and talk to people, that really is like, once you come to the conclusion that, wait, this thing that I thought that I understood implicitly, money, actually is far different, and I was so blind to its reality. What else am I blind to? You're willing to consider what else that I thought was ridiculous am I actually more, was I really wrong about? And so one of the things that people are fanatically, or pretty convinced that they understand, but really don't, is Christianity or, religion. So I think those are a number of reasons why we're seeing what's happening. People are longing for reality. They're longing for truth. They're willing to sacrifice to do that. So I think this is another reason we see guys like Joe Rogan, who, basically podcast for 3 hours. They're not interested in 2-minute sound bites. Their podcasts are 3 hours. It's the biggest podcast in the world. People want to spend time looking deeply into things because they're so tired of everything being fake, and they're sick of the lies. So I think that Bitcoin is, symptom, its growth and its popularity is one indication of people, being sick of the garbage world, that garbage fake world they've been fed.
I love that, this fiat versus Bitcoin, and how Bitcoin kind of pokes a hole in our worldview. Dan, you have a chapter early on called Monetary Anthropology, and I'll put my theologian's hat on for a second. I was actually a little concerned that you were going into anthropology, but you weren't talking about sin. And then it dawned on me, oh, this is really, really helpful, because before we can talk about sin or relationship with God or any of that kind of stuff, which isn't on a lot of people's radar, you compare, I think, fiat anthropology, which I think you connected it to this kind of Darwinian view of life, versus a Bitcoin anthropology. I actually really appreciated how you took us through that and what the Bitcoin anthropology says before you even get to talking about sin or anything else. So can you tell us a little bit about that kind of difference between fiat anthropology and Bitcoin anthropology?
Well, I would love to take credit for that one, but this is actually Jordan's chapter. Right. So if it's okay, I would love for Jordan to answer that question.
Yeah. So this is one of these things. I mentioned this in the book, but yeah, this whole rabbit hole of just trying to understand, like my big question. So I was a philosophy major. I was a philosophy major in college. And so one of my favorite questions to just ask is, well, how do I really know anything? These questions of like epistemology. How do I really know anything? Like, what is my basis for understanding anything? And so for the last 6 years that I've been thinking about Bitcoin, I tried to answer this question, like, what is money? And I tried to think about it from the standpoint of like, what would God think about money? So then, like, you try to have to, like, it's just a whole other thing, but just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we even answer that kind of question? And so basically the Cliff Notes version is, like, money is a tool. And so tools they're only created once you have an actor who's identified a problem that they have. Like tools are created to solve problems. And so before you can ever arrive at really understanding from like a first principles basis what money is, you have to identify who this, like what the actor is that's going to use the tool. And so I just tried to understand, like, well, what does it really mean to be human? And so again, I quote this book. There's a guy named James K.A. Smith who wrote this book called You Are What You Worship. It's a really good book. And so one of the things he talks about is, he basically says, behind every pedagogy, or underneath every pedagogy, is a philosophical anthropology. To which I'm sure all of your audience is like, yes, amen. That's exactly what I was thinking. No. So like behind every pedagogy, so pedagogy is like way of teaching, okay, or like philosophy of teaching. Every pedagogy is rooted in a philosophical anthropology, in an understanding of what it means to be human. And so this was kind of one of the big eye-opening things for me, was just realizing that, okay, this whole fiat versus, fiat money, where it's governments saying that we give money value not by virtue of any work that's being done to produce it, but rather by virtue of our own authority, we just declare it to have value. Like, that is a completely different worldview. It's a completely different way of looking at value and understanding how the world works than a worldview that looks at money and that, money is it's the product of work that's done. And so you can look at this difference. So we, for thousands of years, humans have used gold. In order to get gold as money, you first have to, get guys to go expend energy to dig it, to find it, to dig it up out of the ground. You have to use tools to do that. You have to then refine it. You have to melt it down. You have to do all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of real world energy spending and all kinds of work that go into the production of money. That's contrasted with, fiat currency, where governments just print it either digitally on, strokes on a keyboard, or they just print on a piece of paper, where the same piece of paper that weighs the same, looks the same, is identical, can either be worth $1 or $100, depending on if you put a little bit more ink on it. And so the thing that I realized was just like, man, this represents a totally different anthropology, a totally different understanding of what it means to be human. Or can humans just declare things to have value? Do we just do this papal declaration where we, let it have value? Or does the world actually work that, God designed value to be tied to labor and, value to be tied to, to work and energy usage? And so the more that I did this, the more I became convinced, like, God created a world of sowing and reaping. And a denial of sowing and reaping is a rejection of God. It's a rejection of the way that God, made the world to operate. And so as Christians, we don't want to do that. We don't want to sin. Breaking news. We want to embrace the world that God actually made. And so what that looks like is submitting ourselves to this principle of sowing and reaping. And so again, Bitcoin leans into this. It embraces it embraces the scarcity of the world. It embraces labor as a prerequisite to value, and labor as a prerequisite to wealth. And so again, even though it seems ephemeral and it seems digital and not real, there's a very real sense in which Bitcoin is far more akin to gold and far more aligned with the way that God has actually made the world than fiat currency. And so that's kind of, again, the Cliff Notes version of what I was getting at there.
I love it. We did an episode where we talked specifically about philosophy of Bitcoin, and I was really trying to tie it to reality. I just loved how you then wove in the Imago Dei, and the human being is valued and has value. And then we can get into talking about sin and how that messes up everything, and how desires are disordered and all this kind of stuff. But you kind of have to start with, like, not everything in life is a social construct. There are things that are just real. And
Amen.
The whole fiat mindset of, like, we just social construct, just make it up. That's all that human beings are doing. No, actually, Bitcoin very much goes against that methodology and that mindset. So Good. I'll throw it back to Jared.
So I want to ask about reception of the book too. So Dan, maybe this is a good place for you. So how have people, obviously this is a book written for people who maybe are curious about Christianity, but with, at least from my perspective, with a title as provocative as The Gospel According to Bitcoin, I'm going to guess that you've probably gotten some fun responses from Christians too. So I'm just curious, what has the reception been like? And is there any good stories? Or, I mean, we're trying to get people to Jesus. So have you seen anything like that yet at all?
Yeah, I've been both really, really pleasantly surprised by the reception of the book, but then also, I guess in another sense, somewhat still hungering for more. Our book sales aren't enormous. I don't know. We've sold a few hundred, maybe. So it's not like crazy, and it's kind of humbling when like a guy like Larry Lepard comes out like with a book right after you, and it's like #1 bestseller. Like he's already got well over 90 like 95-star reviews on Amazon.
Bitcoin we're still early, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still early. Yeah. And so anyways, I've been humbled through it. The other thing was one of my first podcast appearances came right after. It was the same day that Wes Huff went on Joe Rogan. And Wes is a buddy of mine. I used to supervise him. And so I'm just like humbled. Yeah. So I was just like so super humbled. I was like, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to make it. Like we're getting out there in the world. And then like I see this, like, okay, like not even close. Anyways, but yeah, in terms of like, the people who've actually read it, I've got some really like, so I gave it to my brother-in-law. He has a buddy who he met through their sons play hockey together. And he found out that he's a Bitcoiner, and he's like, hey Dan, I'm going to order one of your books for him. And he's kind of like been on this, he grew up Catholic, but not really practicing his faith at all. Anyways, he sent me this really sweet message 2 weeks ago because he got the book and he read it, and I'd had a conversation with him as well, and he just thanked me profusely for just the impact that it was having on him and helping to rekindle and renew this faith that he had as a child kind of, but that he'd really wandered away from, and he'd probably be in his 40s now, and so just to see this kind of coming back, it was just super encouraging. And so I see stuff like that and I'm just like, oh, this is amazing. I hear other friends, people I know who have read it, who they're saying like, yeah, like this is really well done. The execution of it is well done. My buddy who runs the Bitcoin nonprofit called Bitcoin is Better, his name's Daniel Hirschberger. He posted about the book, I think it was in mid to late January, and then Max Kaiser retweeted him and said recommended, and so Max Kaiser recommended the book too. And so I was like, this is amazing, because like honestly, like he was one of the guys we had in mind when we wrote this. We're like, if we can reach a guy like Max, like who's like also tweeting stuff like Bitcoin is God, like just like crazy, like idolatrous like view of Bitcoin. Like if we could reach a guy like that, oh, that'd be amazing. And it was cool. I was at the University of Waterloo giving a lecture there, or a talk to our students, and I invited the president of one of their Bitcoin clubs, president of the Bitcoin club at Laurier University, which is right next door. He came and I gave him a copy of the book as well. And he mentioned that since that time that Max recommended the book, he hasn't seen anything which he would classify as Bitcoin heresy since that time. And so I'm like, oh, maybe he's actually taking it to heart. Maybe. I don't know.
We're taking credit. I love it.
We'll take credit for that. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so when people have read it and they've dove into it, I think they've been really blessed by it. It is still very small though. Like, I mean, it's we're hoping for like maybe a big Bitcoin pump, and it'll draw some more attention to it in the near future.
We definitely we need more reviews. So honestly, like hopping in, like what do you call them? Verified reviews are even better. So if you're listening to this, you want to go grab a copy and then leave a verified review. That'd be a big help. We had a whole bunch of people order from the website, which was great because we make more money off of those. So like, you're like, buy local, but then the problem with that is then you don't get verified reviews, and then it doesn't flywheel, the algorithm, everything. So we're still working on that, but But yeah, I think on our end, or on my end, like running into people again, we're still just like getting out there. We've launched like a month and a half ago, and still like, or 2 months ago. But again, you have like Christmas, you have New Year's, you got just a whole bunch of things where it still is kind of just getting out there. But again, I think that, the people who've read it, they recognize. We had one guy write a review the other day. It is such a weird little niche thing that we're trying to do. So, because you're like, yes, we're writing a book that's to non-Christian Bitcoiners. So like calling a book The Gospel According to Bitcoin, it's kind of like a weird. So like it's great. Like I think the book is great. It's just kind of like a weird little niche that I think we're gonna. Like I think it's gonna be like years before we actually, fully, get a big number of people who are gonna read it. Again, I could be totally wrong. I would love to be wrong, but yeah. Again, we didn't create this book to be millionaires. We created this book because we thought, hey, here's this group of people that we love, that we care about. That again, we've had so many conversations. I've had dozens. I could have maybe 100 conversations with people over the past 6 years who are searching, who are trying to figure out what they believe about Christianity, some who are recent Christian converts. And so they're just trying to process these things. They're just trying to figure out what do I believe, what makes sense. And so I think it's a really good resource for that. But again, you're creating this evangelistic resource for people who, you're creating this product for people who don't know that they don't necessarily know or, want your product yet. So it's kind of a weird place to be in.
In many ways, our podcast kind of mirrors this story. And I wonder about, kind of the diffusion of technology. So you have your early adopters, you have your yep. Kind of, so very early, mid-range, and then late adopters. I would say that at least the Christians that are in our tribe aren't always the most like at the front of things and really being open to early adopters. I think Bitcoin, very clearly people like Balaji Srinivasan, these are people that were in technology and they were in kind of the monetary space, and there aren't loads of Christians in that space. You probably gathered most of them in, thank God for Bitcoin. But I do think that we're getting to a place, and we've actually just started having some really fun conversations, kind of our first listeners reaching out to us and saying, hey, I listened to your podcast and I want to talk. And so, we're 20 episodes in, so the first several was kind of crickets, but I do think we're coming to a stage where those that are not always maybe the earliest adopters are beginning to say, maybe this Bitcoin thing is here to stay and it's not going to just fade away or be a tulip mania or whatever.
Mm-hmm. That's my hope for the book. And even maybe just to address one of Jared's questions from earlier, because the book it has a provocative title and it's kind of intentional, just to try and draw more attention to it. But we had a few. I had some little pushback early on. Like I remember talking to Luke Broyles on X, and he was saying he just gave some comments about like how it is a very provocative title. Like you sure you're not committing heresy by going there? But if you actually like look at the genre, like just type in Amazon "The Gospel According to," you'll get a laundry list of things. There's so many books in the space. Like I took a picture and sent it to Jordan like maybe like a year ago. It was like The Gospel According to Starbucks, which I saw in a thrift store. I should have bought it just to take a look at it. But like it's a whole genre. And so I think it works, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that we talk about here a lot, or at least as we process as Christians, right, we're trying to sort of feel like we offer hey, we're Lutheran Christian pastors and we're here to say Bitcoin is not like a problem, right? Like that it's actually part of a solution to a problem sort of thing. And that's a really niche thing. But one of the things that we always like to talk about is how Bitcoin maybe isn't the big solution that sometimes we as Bitcoiners meme it into being, right? So, the phrase Bitcoin fix the money, fix the world. And you address that in the book. But I think it would be great just to kind of hear. We've riffed on that here, but how do you see, what's the contrast of that? How does your faith speak to that meme that we so often hear and see in the Bitcoin world?
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book called "Will Bitcoin Fix This?" Meditation 18, and it goes into the story of this guy named Hans Nielsen Hauge, who he was a missionary to the people of Norway. Well, or he's missionary within Norway, I should say. He had his heart transformed by God, and then he would travel on cross-country skis throughout the villages of Norway. This is 200 years ago, when Norway was a dirt poor place. Like they would literally like boil tree bark and feed it to their kids because they had nothing. And there was this revival that sparked out of this. Like it was something like I think he planted like 1,000 churches, and it's only a country of like 800,000 people. Anyways, I believe that Hauge really set the benchmark, or he set the spiritual bedrock and foundation for a country that would become one of the greatest countries in the world. Like in Norway to this day is always at the top of like the human flourishing indexes, like in terms of like quality of life for their people. And it's because of the gospel that happened, is my belief. And so, we get into the idea of like, does Bitcoin fix this? I believe like the answer is yes and no. There's one book I read a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, is this book by Lauren Cunningham. He's the founder of Youth with a Mission, YWAM. And he is one of those rare people who's traveled to every nation in the world. And so he's got this really diverse view of like what's happening in different cultures, in different parts of the planet. And he distilled in his book, the book is called The Book That Transforms Nations. Basically, it's an argument for how the scriptures can transform a nation. And he says there are 4 things that you need in a society that will transform it from the inside out and turn it into this place where people can like maximize human flourishing, basically. One is to have a biblical view of God. And he contrasts Christianity to both Islam and to Hinduism. Islam focuses on unity, and Hinduism focuses on diversity, 1 million plus gods in Hinduism. And so he says it's in Christianity where you have this God, 3 in 1, where you have the Trinity that has both the unity and the diversity, and that in a society where you can all be pointing in the same direction, have a unified cause, but each excel in your own individualistic specialties and have that diversity as well, that's where societies thrive. He also talks about too having a biblical view of humanity. He visited this one place where in Asia where they worship rats, and you can imagine if there's a society that worships rats, it's going to cause all kinds of problems. They would have temples for rats. They let the rats roam free, and so the humans suffer because they're all getting diseases, and it's a terrible place. And so you have to have a biblical view of humanity as well. Recognize, we are above the animals, and rightfully so. We were created to not to dominate the environment, but to curate it and to rule over it. And then third is the society has to believe that truth exists and can be known. Like you have to have those 2 things, and then that we are responsible for living by the truth, number 4. And so, and this is part of the impetus for the book as well. It's just like I think Bitcoin will bring us to a certain point, and it's definitely doing a lot of the prep work in terms of cultivating people's hearts, and it will change a lot of the incentives in our world and hopefully make things more truthful, because it's a truthful form of money. And if it can be adopted, it will do a lot of good change in our world. But without transformed hearts, we could end up in a place in the future where Bitcoin's used mainly for personal gains and for greed, and that the people who own the most in the world aren't generous. They harbor their wealth, and they don't give back to people who are in need, and all those kinds of things. And so to have these, we really need like a spiritual revival from the inside out. And so yes and no, Bitcoin can do a lot, but it can't change the human heart, and therefore it can't fully change society, I would say.
I want to add something there, because this is one of my pet peeves. Okay, so there's a comedian. How many of you guys have heard this comedian? His name is Michael Jr. Have you heard of him? Okay, so he's like a black guy. I think he's from Indiana. I can't remember something, but he had this bit years ago, probably 15 years ago, where he would say, "You ever met somebody who was oversaved, and he would just basically go on about they'd like spiritualize, they quote unquote over spiritualize this thing. And so one of the things that I run into all the time is people who they object to the idea of Bitcoin fixes this because they stumble. They're like, are people going to make an idol of Bitcoin if we do this? And I'm just like, I can't for the life of me. I'm just like, I don't understand. Obviously, like, there's this thing where obviously it's conceptually possible, and for people who are not Christians, obviously this is a more thing. But I just don't think this is actually a thing. And so, like, here's an example, okay? So the idea that you could say Bitcoin fixes this, or like the idea that Dan has said multiple times, like Bitcoin can save, like it can save us. It can save the money is better money that saves us. Like people get real weird. Christians get weirded out by this usage of something that's not Jesus with the word savior, okay? And what I want to do, is I want to calm their fears. So we're going to read 2 Kings, okay? 2 Kings 13:5. Christians like Bible verses, okay? Therefore, the Lord gave Israel a savior so that they escaped from the land of the Syrians, and the people of Israel lived in their homes as formerly. So this word savior is not something that's only to be used for Jesus. Like people act like that's wait a second, you're using the S word. That can only be referred to Jesus. No, it's not true. Like it is a generic word. And so insofar as in its limited sense, Bitcoin it's salvific, okay? Obviously in a limited sense, Bitcoin is a savior in a real way that it's okay for us to agree with. No one is saying it's going to ultimately save your soul, that money's the most important thing. Not at all. That's ridiculous. But there's no problem with saying that like Bitcoin is a savior. Like it is. Like what it's doing, it's having a saving effect on, in multiple ways that are demonstrable that we can point out. Obviously, there's people who take this way too far. There's nothing wrong with Christians using this idea or concept, or we shouldn't be afraid of using these words in relation to, in relation to other things. If people do the same thing with Donald Trump. Trump has come to save us from certain things, whatever. Sure, I don't have any problem saying Trump in very real limited senses is a savior, okay? We would have had one set of consequences if certain candidate had come in there. We're getting not those ones, and in my argument, I'd say they're a lot better than what they would have been otherwise. And so, sure, he saved us, okay? God saved us through him. Whatever you want to say, these are limited senses. This is how language works. We use words in limited ways that it's totally okay to do. So yeah, that would be my
I love it.
Pushback.
totally agree with that. We talked about this on an episode, and my point was basically that the problem with some Christians is that they think it's me and Jesus, and they don't think at all about how Christianity impacts the rest of the world. So Dan, you talked about human flourishing. Bitcoin fixes a lot of stuff that's really helpful for in nurturing human flourishing. And in that kind of, like you said, limited sense, Bitcoin, as Christians, we care about so much because Jesus is risen from the dead bodily. We care about people's bodies. We care about what's going on in churches. We care about what's going on in countries. And so because of that, we're happy to say, yeah, Bitcoin does fix an awful lot of stuff. I kind of like Saylor's quote in your book that fix the money, Bitcoin fixes maybe half the world or something like that. Yeah. Or half the problems in the world.
Half the problems in the world.
I think that
even Saylor's more humble than he was 4 years ago. Praise the Lord. It's incredible.
Maybe he read our book.
One last question. Hope that happens at some point. There have been rumblings that he's curious about faith, or maybe even is a Christian. I don't know him personally, but I want to finish out with the last question from our co-host David Ruffner. He has been interested in ministries and local congregations that are maybe getting into Bitcoin, not individually, but as a congregation or as a ministry, as an organization, and bringing some Bitcoin into their reserves. You guys worked recently with this Brilliance Labs and the Magnolia Foundation or Magnolia Fund to to kind of work on this a little bit. So do you have any stories about churches or ministries getting into the Bitcoin reserve space?
Yeah, I mean, we're still, well, first of all, there's churches, there's actually a lot of churches that are out there that have already done this, that are, again, the way that they did it is not because they invited somebody to come in there. It's because they had some fanatical, insane Bitcoiner within their church who just said, hey, I'm only tithing in Bitcoin. so do with that what you will, you know. But then again, I would encourage the Lutherans here. Again, I don't know if you saw the news from a couple weeks ago, but the Presbyterians, the PCA, they're doing I can't remember what the term is. Basically, they encourage their congregations, their pastors to study the topic and consider, allocating a portion of the, of their church funds to it. So no official declaration or anything like that, that we're doing this from the top down. But again, they're open to it. We know there's some good brothers who are pastors within the PCA. So just throwing that out there, the PCA is getting a little head start. If there's anything that can, I guess saying the Catholics had a little head start would probably put a fire under some Lutherans more than the PCA. But
we love PCA. Covenant Seminary is just down the street from us here.
Oh,
I have
awesome.
a lot of PCA friends, but I didn't know that.
Yep.
I think that the PCA is definitely ahead of the Lutherans.
Yeah. So, but in terms of that project, we just basically, the three organizations. So it's the Magnalia Foundation, Brilliance Labs, and then TGFB. Just basically are pooling some money and then giving out small grants, like a couple $100 to any organization. Well, you had to apply or whatever, and then we chose some organizations, and then we're just giving them Bitcoin. They're going to go through a process, learning how to use it, like a little tutorial process over a couple months, and then again just learning more about it. And then if they finish that course, then we pay them. We're going to give them even more at the end. And so we're still in the early days. People are still responding. But again, it's a cool. Yeah, again, you have to start somewhere, and so something like this, offering some free money to organizations to incentivize them to to pay attention to it is again, it's a good. Like this is what we do. This is again, I would say this is biblical. This is godly. This is what God does. He gives gifts to men. This is one of the things that kings do all throughout the scriptures, is they give gifts. And so, a gift is something that you haven't earned. And so these, people, we're trying to embody that. We're giving you this thing. We understand you don't, on your own, most people, you have no reason to think about Bitcoin as far as you know. And so we're going to incentivize you to think about this and consider these things by giving, of what we have. So, giving away a scarce resource, we're going to give that away. And so we'll see how it goes. I'll let you know, report back in a few months.
Love it.
One of the things Jordan said there is it takes sometimes a fanatical Bitcoin from within to move a church or a ministry in the right direction. I will have to say, for 3 years straight, when we just had our strategic planning meetings in January to look forward to our next fiscal year within Power to Change here, and for 3 years straight, I've put the sticky note up on the chart as a potential strategic or a potential strategy for us as Power to Change to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve or to adopt Bitcoin in some way, shape, or form. And it was just last month I was on a talk with my director, because it always just gets laughed away, and they're like, yeah, what are you talking about, Dan? Like that's your side hobby thing. But my director confessed that the slow, gentle trickle of me bringing up Bitcoin over and over again has him thinking about it more and more. And now we're going to be setting a goal to have at least one Bitcoin in our reserves by the end of next fiscal year, which would be great. So, and yeah, I also had a talk with our financial controller, and she's looking at options for accepting crypto donations. And so my space there is like I would gladly accept any form of crypto, but I want the Bitcoin to be held at least for set a timeline of like 4 or 5 years.
One of the things I would add to that is, and this will make sense, but the organizations in terms of nonprofits that have been quickest to move have been missions organizations.
Sure. Yep.
Because again, moving money, again, we're talking about a lot of people when they're thinking about Bitcoin, especially Americans, you're thinking about it from the standpoint of Bitcoin as an investment for the long term, whatever. that makes sense given the context in which you're learning about it. But there's millions of people who do not have a currency that's anywhere near as good as the dollar.
Yep.
And so they're looking for things to both help them move money quickly around the world, move money cheaply, and to have something that can't be a currency that can't be devalued by the government. It's and the dollar is that to a certain degree, but there's plenty of places around the world. Most of the world does not have ready access to dollars, but they can have ready access to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is available to basically everybody who has internet, and so that's 4 to 5 billion people, and so basically Bitcoin is an increasingly interesting and desirable option for missions organizations on that front. I'll share this. I won't say the name, but I got an email this morning, or a DM on Twitter this morning, from a guy who said, "Hey, I have a friend who's part of this missions organization. They want to buy $3 million worth of Bitcoin."
Oh,
and
amazing.
I was like, "What?" So again, you're having increasing, and again, I could get into the reasons for that, but I won't. There's strategic reasons, missions related reasons why more and more organizations are looking to Bitcoin, and why Bitcoin's increasingly attractive. So again, this is a big organization, but still $3 million is a lot even for them. But it just works out that it's given the situation they're in, it makes sense for them for money movement reasons.
so good. Dan, Jordan, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that our listeners will check out both of your books, Thank God for Bitcoin and The Gospel According to Bitcoin, especially for Christians, for Lutherans that love theology. I think you'll find a lot of meat and substance in both of these books. So, great to be with you guys, and let's keep the conversation going.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Ben and Jared.